Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. Since the launch of the MySejahtera app, there have been persistent concerns around varying themes such as data and privacy, its efficacy in shaping policy, and now more recently around ownership. With the government now moving to relax restrictions as part of what it calls its transition to endemicity phase, has the time come to reevaluate the need for a COVID-19 surveillance app? Joining us on the show tonight, we have Bu Sulin, Editor-in-Chief of the health news portal Code Blue. Sulin, Code Blue really led the pack when it came to highlighting some of the Public Accounts Committee's concerns around MySejahtera and its ownership. I'm just wondering what that controversy had signaled to you.
Hi, Melissa and Sharad. Thanks for having me on the show. So essentially, the MySejahtera issue has become a huge national issue, mainly because of concerns over critically who owns or who has access to personal data collected by the app, who owns the app, the IP rights. So all of this right now is still very confusing, and this mainly stems because of the government's own admission to the Public Accounts Committee that the MySejahtera app, to our big surprise and shock, was never developed with a contract in place with the app developer. So all of these issues now are still going on, and the opposition leader Anwar Ibrahim, yesterday he called for the MySejahtera issue to be debated in a special parliament sitting together with other issues involving MRT, DNB and Sapura on potential abuse of power and mismanagement, which I think should happen. There really needs to be more debate about this, despite the Health Minister Khairi Jamaluddin's explanations to the Senate. But it's clear that the public still isn't convinced. And you can see this from the drop in MySejahtera check-ins. When you go to several malls in the Klang Valley, not only are they no longer enforcing check-ins at the entrance, but even individual stores within different shopping centers, they don't even display QR codes anymore. So whether this is following official policy, which hasn't been announced yet, or whether it signals their distrust, not just among individuals, but among businesses themselves who don't want other third parties to know how many visits their store gets every hour, every day, that still remains to be seen.
Yeah, so there are these real substantial concerns over governance, and I think this is something that plagues, all areas of governance in the country. MySejahtera just one instance of it. But I want to come back to the app and the very concept of the app, and whether it has served a purpose over the last 2 years. And I'm thinking, Sulin, of the parallel system, where people don't use the app and they can write their names in. So I just imagine there's a mountain of little notebooks or ledgers with people's scribblings of their names and IC numbers and entry times. And I'm not sure where all of that or any of that has gone. And it may be a metaphor for the app itself, right? How efficacious has it been?
Well, throughout the past 2 years, I'm going to be honest, I don't think MySejahtera has been very helpful in contact tracing. I think it was nothing more than a glorified Foursquare app because it mainly relied on scanning QR codes, which is actually a very, very basic function. And we've talked to, so the Code Blue team has talked to lots of different healthcare workers in the past, healthcare experts throughout the past 2 years of the pandemic. And when the pandemic was really bad, that was because contact tracing was overwhelmed. And this was mainly manual contact tracing. So essentially, for most of the pandemic, a huge portion of the contact tracing was just manual, because I think it was a lot easier for contact tracers to just simply call up a positive case and then interview them to find out who they were contact with before they tested positive, rather than to have to cross-check entries on who was in who checked into what particular premise at what time, which doesn't tell you like how long a person spent there or whether the person was actually in close contact for several minutes, talking to each other in a place. So the utility of the app itself, I don't think it was very useful. Currently, right now, the app is used to report self-tests, COVID self-tests, to host our vaccine certs, and also the health assessment tool is used for people to report to report their symptoms so that MOH can send you a message on the app if your symptoms deteriorate. So that I think is still helpful. But in terms of contact tracing, state surveillance, it's long past its due date, MySejahtera.
Okay, well, I mean, those things I'm sure has its usefulness, but I'm just wondering whether or not the MySejahtera app should be continued as part of SOP in this during this transition to endemicity phase. We've heard calls for the Ministry of Health to review its use or to even discontinue its use. What do you think, Celine?
So I think during the pandemic, I don't think MySejahtera is very useful anymore. I think what's important moving here on out is that people should have access to quick diagnostic, to quick testing, and access to healthcare in hospitals. So whether it's a treatment when your symptoms deteriorate, the Paxlovid pill. So when you have all that in place, you don't really have to bother with the app anymore. Like I said, it doesn't matter with the virus being everywhere right now. It really doesn't matter where you got infected. In terms of, I also have written an op-ed about how MySejahtera can be used beyond COVID, beyond the pandemic. This has been talked about for a couple of years, actually. You know, the idea of a super health app or a universal healthcare app that contains our health records, so that patient records can be moved seamlessly from one facility to another, whether it's in the public sector or with the public and private sector. And this, you can even, so I even talked about how you can use MySejahtera to sync to our Apple Health app or Google Fit app to track our weight, BMI, blood sugar, blood pressure, and all this data, right? If it's used properly, is actually very helpful. I mean, it'll be very helpful to not just individuals to help keep track or to keep ourselves healthier by monitoring our own health status, our workout, and our lifestyle, but it also helps the Ministry of Health come up with targeted health interventions to specific communities and districts based on real-time data rather than the current method of using 4-year NCD surveys and big data modeling from this data. I mean, you have 38 million users, but even if just a fraction of them regularly input their health data, that's still enough. You can still use that data to do big data modeling to model Malaysia's healthcare burden, like how much it costs and where over the next few years. And then MOH requests for annual budgets would be evidence-based. But I have to caution that you can only do all this. I mean, this is like a utopia, right? with a great app that's useful to both individuals and the government. But the crucial factor really is whether MOH, whether the government can be trusted with such a huge amount of data. And I would say...
Yeah, Price, please, you were coming to...
Yeah, and I would say that based on how MySejahtera has been handled so far, it honestly doesn't give me much confidence that they have the competence and that they understand really how important it is to have patient trust, to have people's trust and confidence in an app like this. So until and unless they seriously address all our concerns with specific measures, beyond just verbal assurances that our data is safe, that's not enough. You have to show what is the measures that you're taking to keep our data safe, who exactly has access to the different kinds of data collected by the app. When MySejahtera user issues are being resolved, who exactly is tasked to resolve those issues? Who has access and authority to resolve those issues? We don't know all of that yet.
Right.
So until you resolve all of that.
So, Celine, of course, Malaysia is plagued by a lot of theater in governance. There's a lot of, it looks smart and shiny, but it actually doesn't do very much. And I wonder if, you can address, as you've begun to do, which is the utility of big data for government policy making, right? That's something that is also, but has a dark side. I mean, so you say it's utopian to imagine all this will happen, but the dystopic dimension to it is that there is increased surveillance on our lives. And so the question really is, are these trade-offs necessary, or can we find a middle ground that doesn't deliver personal preferences and movement data to big government, and perhaps corporations that might collude with them, but still have something that can be of utility to drive policy and better governance?
So, Sharat, I think the middle ground here is that it has to be an opt-in function. So I would suggest that the Ministry of Health just forget about MySejahtera, forget about the 38 million users. Just let it go. Just let it go, and then use what we have learned from the pandemic. And you already had experience managing the MySejahtera app. So use that experience to come up with not just legislation, proper privacy legislation that is subject that the government is subject to, because currently the Personal Data Protection Act exempts the government, and also come up with proper data security and protection measures, and then create a really good app, a useful app, and ask people to opt in to download that app. So start from there. So I think when you start from that point, then people would have confidence in the app rather than the opt-out mechanism of like just asking people to uninstall the app if they no longer want to use the app. I think that is still not enough at this point.
Okay, so start from scratch using the experience and knowledge that we've gained over the past 2 years. Okay, Sulim, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. We appreciate your time and you sharing your insights. That was Bu Sulin, Editor-in-Chief of Code Blue. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, welcome back to Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris. With me is Sharad Kutan. Let's continue our discussion about the future of MySejahtera amid a steady decline of check-ins on the app and the continued controversy around ownership, data and privacy. Has MySejahtera outlived its usefulness, or can the app be put to better use? Let's ask Assistant Professor Dr. Farhan Rusli. He's a public health medicine specialist at International Islamic University Malaysia. He's also on the Selangor Public Health Advisory Council. Dr. Farhan, is MySejahtera essentially a good app? Did it succeed as a COVID-19 surveillance app in helping inform pandemic management?
Well, I think there's a few ways to look at it. If you would like to ask me whether it's actually a good app, it is a good app. So that's the bottom line. It is good. But was the timing right? I think the timing was completely off. It was about 1.5 years too late. The functions that came in was just a little too much down the line for it to be as extremely useful as what we wanted it to be. And I think what people need to understand is that when you're talking about pandemic response, it's about the ability for you to respond as fast as possible. That's the key here. It's about speed and time. If you are unable to actually get it done quickly, then you always be chasing the curve. And that's why we have always been done for the past 2 years. We were never ahead of it. And yeah, so I hope that answers the question. Is it a good app? It is, but it was just a little too late.
Okay, Farhan, there was also the Sri Lanka app, which was in some sense kind of a contender, during the early days, and I know there were a lot of discussions, in fact, quite heated arguments about the differences between the two. In terms of design, we're not to go back to those that controversy as it were, but we look at the design. Were there differences in the way those two apps were thought through as a tool for pandemic management?
Well, I'm just going to be really honest and open here. Yeah, Sri Lanka, I mean, I'm not going to be in favors of which side. I'm just going to be stating facts. Sri Lanka was always ahead of MySejahtera, and MySejahtera was actually always trying to catch up to the app itself. And to be honest with you, to be frank, I was personally asked by some of the staffing from MySejahtera whether they could actually have access to the architecture of Sri Lanka so that they could replicate it and put it into MySejahtera. And this was in the mid 2020, uh, coming into end of 2020. So right there, we knew that there were already issues propping up, because here I was thinking, if it was fully developed, if it was really done in that way, or there was people working behind it, why would people actually work on the architecture itself? Why ask if it's already built? So I think a lot of people don't understand this, that MySejahtera, in essence, its main basic principle was just an attendance app where people would actually use it for human resource, and they would log in what time you came to work, what time you left, and that was the basic principle of it. And after that, it grew from that QR code scanner into something more, such as contact tracing and everything else.
Okay, all right. So we've had this app for a while, for 2 years now. We're trying to, it's integrated as part of our lives. But what we're seeing in the past few weeks, the trend has been a decline, a steady decline in check-ins. You see that anecdotally as you're out in shopping malls. You see people just walk in without scanning MySejahtera anymore, and therefore there's been kind of growing calls to discontinue the use of the app. I think the Ministry of Health has also said they're going to review the usage of the app. What would you like to see, Dr. Farhan? Do you think MySejahtera has outlived its usefulness?
Well, I think you have to go to the basic principles of why you are checking in the first place. And the basic principle is for you to be able to effectively do contact tracing. And why do you need to do contact tracing? Is so that you can actually be able to quarantine people who are exposed, regardless whether they test positive or negative. But the rules now that have changed shows that even if you are a close contact, if you have no symptoms, you don't need to test. So in this way, at the juncture that we are in, there is absolutely no epidemiological value to using MySejahtera anymore. So what does that mean? It means that if you would like to use it from a public health aspect, the only thing that it's using now is actually just tracking your movements, but it does not help in our response from a public health perspective, because it's not doing what it's supposed to do. So in that way, I think that there is absolutely no use for MySejahtera now.
So, sorry to harp on the Sri Lanka app, but I was very interested to know if Sri Lanka had, and because in our previous conversation, we talked about the way in which technology can aid public health policies, and the kind of data that's collected and at the scale at which it's collected can actually help shape policies, but also help people understand their relationship to their health. Do you see, whether it's in the form of a tweet MySejahtera, or you junk MySejahtera, or you adopt something different, that we could develop a technology that will address many of the problems that underscore the pandemic, like the high level of NCDs in this country? Is that a possibility?
Well, I think, sure, I think anything is a possibility, but I think I have to be very clear here. Data can be taken or can be collected in so many different forms, and you can have a treasure trove of a lot of data, but you will probably need brains to actually interpret the data that you've collected. Without that, no matter how much data you collect, it's going to be absolutely useless if you do not know how to put it to good use. And I think it's very clear, because what happens here is this: you need to be able to actually foresee what are you going to do with the data before you even collect the data. And this is actually a proper methodological thinking into what you want to do once you've collected data. So I think here lies the problem. You have a lot of data, but you're unable to channel it in the proper way. Or you've collected data and people started using it, but then you've changed policies that now makes the data obsolete. There's no point in you collecting check-ins if you're not going to ask people or notify them for self-quarantine and all these things. So that's why I think when you would like to approach public health digitalization, it has to be on a full architecture with complete blueprints that you already see the results even prior to your planning. So this is what we mean by systematic and holistic approach to digitalization of healthcare. You cannot just do something, react to something, collect something, not knowing what to do with it. And I think this is the reason why a lot of issues have happened with MySejahtera. And it's not the fault of the ministry, or it's not the fault of the current minister or the previous minister. It's just because even from the get-go, we did not see the end point of MySejahtera. And that's why the design, the flow of the program did not follow the proper protocols, the proper methodology. And that's why we are here where we are.
Okay, well, then maybe there are lessons to be learnt from the past 2 years. What lessons did MySejahtera teach us in the past 2 years that we can use in preparation for the next public health crisis?
Well, I think the first thing, Mel, I think this is a really good question. Number one is that you do not have to rely on outside parties. I think that's the main goal here. The first thing that you have to remember is that because we are the ones who actually made the policy that any sort of health or medical records, electronic records, must be kept in-house in the country. Yes, you can say that it's kept in cloud, but where are the original servers for that? I'm sure it's outside of the country because we don't have the capabilities here. So we have to start developing it in-house in the ministry, and the ministry needs to set up a division which is bigger than what it has now, because right now they have an e-health division which does not deal with all of this, right? They have all these small components that they need to integrate and bring together and redevelop it. For me, put MySejahtera aside, call it what it is, take your losses, admit to whatever is the problems with it, and then just start to redevelop and design it with proper end goals in mind. Only in this way will you be able to start thinking on how you want to integrate your electronic medical records. You want to have a proper system. You want to have a proper security features built in to ensure that you have a proper public health app that is digitalized for the next pandemic, or even for the next small outbreak. So I think this is what we should focus our money on and our energy on.
Right. So Farhan, we are or have had a government by buzzwords for the longest time, but if we go beyond the buzzwords, right? What would you like to see? And does it have to happen only at the federal level? You work with the Selangor government. Are states in a position to develop innovation and think through their own specific problems to help their populations?
Well, number one, I think everybody must take this into account. Health has always been a federal matter. Number two, even if that's the case, you have to pay attention to a lot of states that are actually developing it. And you talk about Sri Lanka, because I can talk about Sri Lanka because I see it develop in front of my own eyes, and it's local talent. And there is no reason for the federal government to not want to work with local partners. And even if they did, believe me, none of the fiasco of MySejahtera would have occurred, opening up books of Singapore and all these other things. None of these issues would have happened. And I think innovation does not need to have, segregation between federal and state. I think what's important to understand is this. Innovation can come from anybody. Innovation can come from any side. And the federal government must be able to have the ability to pick it up. And this is the biggest thing that I think we have to tell the federal government. It's time that ministries play the role of policymaker rather than playing the role of implementer. You have to stop doing everything on your own and rather focus on actually being the monitor and the surveillance part of a ministry like other countries, rather than having to do everything from the top to the bottom all by yourself. And if you do that, then you will actually avoid a lot of problems.
Farhan, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining us on the show tonight. That was Public Health Medicine Specialist Dr. Farhan Rusli, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.